Tonight we are continuing our study of Philippians through a series called Even Though. Even Though. And so here's been our objective this study, right? Is to figure out, because when we read the book of Philippians, right, we find that Joel, that's not a guy, Paul is very joyful. Joel, this is his nickname, okay? Just roll with it, all right? Paul is really joyful, and we've been asking this question, right? Is it possible, and if so, how do we or can we have joy in the midst of difficult things in life, right? Difficult circumstances or whatever. And so we've been working through that for a little bit, and so tonight we're going to continue that. And as you can see, I've entitled tonight's message, All I Do Is Win, right? You guys know that. All I do is win, no matter what. Her hands are already ready. I'm not even going there. Okay, everybody's hands go. And they say that. Okay, all right. Oh, wow, okay, all right. Back to the scripture. My wife just got lost in the moment. It's okay. It happens. So man, tonight, again, we're going to be in Philippians. We're going to be in chapter 1. It's going to be, this is not the right passage. I was like, that's not the right passage. We're going to be in a couple verses after that, but that's okay. It's the same, relative place. And so we're going to be in Philippians 1. We're going to start in verse 18 and work our way through almost the rest of the chapter. Not quite, but we'll get there. And man, it's going to be a good time. So let me ask you this question. Do you guys know anybody that is overly competitive? Everybody, I see you cutting your eyes some different places. All right, be careful here, all right? This is not worth our friendships, all right? I just want to know. Is anybody in here that would admit, right, by themselves, I am overly... Ashley, okay, anybody else? All right, well, we've got a lot of competitive people. Okay, thank you. We'll see you at the altar. No, I'm just kidding. That's not a bad thing. Right, overly, and sometimes we all get that way. I get that way in certain circumstances, all that stuff. There was one person that when I hear the word competitive, I think of. It is my, did you say Colton? It is my brother-in-law, Colton. A lot of you guys don't know him, and that's okay. I'll give you the quick scoop. A lot of you guys do. Colton is an awesomely goofy, funny guy that married my sister, right? He really is a great guy. We're still wondering how he married my sister, right? No, I'm just kidding. He's a great guy. He actually serves in the Air Force out in Arizona, although they're moving back to Texas here pretty soon. Colton is probably, hands down, the most competitive guy I know, okay? Like, you can't, there's nothing about it. Like, everything is a competition. It's like, okay, if you're both walking a dog, his has to go to the bathroom first, right? It's that kind of stuff. Or, I don't know why that popped into my mind, but that was like the dumb stuff, right, that he makes a competition out of, right? In fact, every time he's in town, he takes a cup and he puts it by my parents' fireplace, and it becomes a basketball challenge where they all sit in different seats and we throw paper balls and see who can make the most. And if you make one before him, it's the end of the world, right? He is so competitive. And so here's the fun part about it. He is a, it hurts to say, Dallas Mavericks fan, okay? He is a Dallas Mavericks fan, which most of you guys are like, that's fine, that's okay. Not in the McNeil household, okay? We are Houston Rockets fans. This is basketball, by the way, for those guys that weren't recognizing it. We are Houston Rockets fans, right? And so here's the deal. To be a Dallas Mavericks fan is treason, okay? And I know most of you guys out here are like, I like the Mavericks. It's okay. We can still be friends and worship together. We just don't have to get along all the time in that regard. You can be wrong. It's okay, right? And so he is a diehard Mavericks fan. And so there's always trash talk, right? Always trash talk. So a couple years back, Colton was in town, and we were watching the Rockets play the Mavs on like a Monday night or something, okay? Okay? And so here's the deal. This isn't to make myself feel better or to put you guys down, but the Rockets were killing them, okay? Just if you're taking notes, write that down. Rockets won. That's important, right? And so we were sitting there talking trash, all this stuff, and at the end of the game, the Rockets win. Me and Alex and my dad, we look at Colton and we say, what now, right? Like, he's been talking smack this whole time, talking trash this whole time, and we're like, what now? And you know what he tells me? You know what he tells us? He says, it's okay. I got James Harden on my fantasy team, so I'm still winning. Right? And we're like, hold on, back up. My dad gets so mad. He's like, fantasy is not real, it's fantasy, right? He gets so mad at that. And Colton's like, don't care, right? James Harden, you guys will not even get on that topic, right? He was going off that night, got him a ton of fantasy points, and so at the end of the night, we were expecting to rub it in his face, and Colton's like, it's all good. Like, I'm still winning in my fantasy league, right? What he was doing was he was saying this, I'm going to win one way or the other, right? Either the Mavericks do really great and I get to rub it in your face, or the Rockets do really great and I get to rub it in somebody else's face, right? Like, I get to win no matter what, okay? Now, here's the deal. When it comes to sports and someone's competitive, that's very frustrating. But, it's a really good perspective for life. You know what I mean? Like nothing got him down. He was just like, it's all right, man. I know it didn't turn out the way I necessarily wanted it to, but I'm still going to win, right? There's this theme, right? This perspective that he was going to win no matter what, right? And I love, like, that really gives us an idea of what Paul is saying tonight, right? We're going to see him wrestling a little bit in his heart. We're going to see him walking through, trying to decide some stuff in this text. But what we do see overall is he knows this. No matter what happens, it's good. He's going to win. Check it out with me. We're going to be in chapter 1. We're going to pick up in verse 18, really the last line of verse 18, because I'm not really sure why they split it before that. Anyways, we're not going to get into that tonight. But verse 18, and just in case you haven't been with us, let me just remind you of the highlights, okay? One, we're reading the book of Philippians, right, which is a letter, right? A 2,000-year-old letter that was written to a church in Philippi, right, by a guy named Paul. And here's the deal. Paul is writing this letter from where? Prison, jail, all of the above, right? Yes. From somewhere where he was not free, right? He was in prison. He was in jail at the time of writing this letter. And surprisingly, the thing he talks about most is joy, right? Is how to be happy, where to find joy. It's like, what? And so we've been kind of dissecting this and looking at it. And here's what we discovered. Week 1, we talked about how he found joy in spiritual faithfulness, right? You guys remember that? We opened up, just read about 5 or 6 verses, and talked about where he was finding joy in that. Last week, we talked about how he found joy in gospel proclamation. He found joy in the gospel. And we talked about all the ways that he talked about that the gospel had transformed his life, right? And here's kind of the major emphasis tonight. Week number 3 is that he also finds joy in ultimate deliverance. Ultimate deliverance. And we're going to look at how that plays out, what that looks like here in the text. And so we're going to do something kind of unique tonight. I want us to read the whole text tonight that we're going to be looking at up front, and then we're going to break it down. We don't always do that, but I think it'll be helpful tonight. So, open up your Bibles. Join me in verse number 18 of Philippians chapter 1. Look at the very last line of verse number 18. This is what Paul says. He says, "And I therein do rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice. For I know that this shall turn to my salvation through your prayer and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ." Verse 20. "According to my earnest expectation and my hope, that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but that with all boldness, as always, so now also, Christ shall be magnified in my body, whether it be by life or by death." Verse 21. "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Oh. But if I live in the flesh, this is the fruit of my labor. Yet what shall I choose? I wot not," or I don't know. He says in 23, "For I am in a strait between two, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to abide in the flesh is more needful for you. And having this confidence, I know that I shall abide and continue with you, all for your furtherance and joy of faith, that your rejoicing may be more abundant in Jesus Christ for me by my coming to you again." All right, guys, that's the text tonight. We're going to end at verse 26 tonight, and we're going to break it down here in just a second. And I know I just said a lot of words. We read a lot of verses, whatever. Let me give you the main idea. Paul says this: no matter what happens, this thing ends well for me. That's the summary. He says, if they kill me, cool. I'm going to go be with Jesus, and that's a win. If they let me go, I'm going to come see you, and that's a win. Right? He said, no matter what happens to me in this situation, I win in this thing. They can't do anything to get at me, right? Like I'm going to win. And it just blows me away, this perspective that he has. My question is, how in the world does he have that perspective? How do you get that? How do you have a perspective that looks in very difficult circumstances and trials and says, you know what, this isn't even a big deal. I'm going to win no matter what. Where do you find that, man? And I think he actually reveals that for us tonight. And so tonight, I want to answer the question, what did Paul know and understand that gave him this perspective? And so I just want to give you 4 quick things tonight as far as the major outline goes of where Paul found this, right? Paul's ultimate winning. How did he have this perspective? And how did he ultimately win in either case? And there's a couple of things that are very, very important about this, all right? So stay with me. The first thing we see is this. Paul ultimately won because, one, he hopefully anticipated God's deliverance. He hopefully anticipated God's deliverance, right? Read that last part of verse 18. It says, and I therein do rejoice. He's talking about the gospel being proclaimed, Christ being preached. And then he says this, yea, and will rejoice. Not only do I rejoice in the gospel, in Christ being preached, but I also rejoice in verse 19. He says, for I know that this shall turn to my salvation through your prayer and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, according to my earnest expectation and my hope. According to my expectation and my hope. Let me point out a few things about this for you, right? That word salvation there in verse 19 is a very special, very important word. It's the word soteria. Soteria. And salvation is a very good translation of it, but oftentimes it's also often used to represent rescue or safety or deliverance, right? Deliverance. In fact, soteria, that is the word that we use theologically to talk about the doctrine of salvation. It's called soteriology, right? Just a little fun fact for you there, and that's because it often means salvation, right? And so here's the deal, man. Here's my question tonight. When Paul says this, stay with me, right? Look at me. He says, hey, man, I know that this is going to turn out for my deliverance, for my salvation. How does he mean that? Does he mean he's going to get out of jail? Right? Is this a physical deliverance that he's talking about, or is he talking about spiritual things? And the reality is, I think he's probably speaking to both, to be totally honest. He knows that ultimately there is deliverance, but I think we find later on from the rest of the chapter that we read that he's actually talking about a physical deliverance. You say, Austin, how do you say that? Well, look at verse 25. He says, and having this confidence, I know that I shall abide, or that I should continue to live and continue with you all for your furtherance and joy of faith, that your rejoicing may be more abundant in Jesus Christ for me by my coming to you again. Here's what I'm saying, man. Paul was believing, he was anticipating, he was expecting him to actually get out of chains. That was his expectation here. He's saying, hey, I am confident that I'm going to keep living. I'm confident that I'm going to get to see you again. And I believe that God is going to deliver me from these chains. Right? That's what he's saying. And there's a couple other notes, right? He says, I know this deliverance is going to come. He says, one, through your prayer. Right? The church in Philippi, they were faithfully praying for him to be delivered, to be freed, to be let go. Right? He also says, by the supply of the Spirit, right? This supplying is a reference to ministering, right? To helping, that the Spirit, that he was working in his life, and he found confidence in this. And then lastly, that phrase in verse 20, according to my earnest expectation and my hope. You guys know what it's like to hope for something? And to hope so confidently that you expect it? That's what he's saying, man. He said, man, I am anticipating, I am expecting to be out of these chains. That's what he's expecting. Now, historically, here's what we know, right? We talked about this week one. If this was written in the time of his Roman imprisonment, he never does. He actually dies after this, right? We got to wrestle with that. Was he wrong? What's going on here? But let's back up for a second, and I want to point out something massive about this. Because I want you to put yourself in his shoes, right? This dude is in prison for absolutely nothing, doing nothing wrong other than believing and proclaiming Jesus. And when all of us, I myself for sure, would have been discouraged and borderline hopeless, he says, I ain't even worried about it. He says, I am anticipating that I'm going to get out of here, man. I'm going to see you guys again. Because I don't think God is done in everything yet, right? He is so hopeful. And so here's where I'm going with this, man. It teaches me something about faith. Because can I be honest with you guys? Naturally speaking, I'm not really an optimist. Okay? Anybody in here is like super optimistic? Anybody in here like pessimistic? You're Eeyore, that's your life. It's okay. I'm not really either one of those things, right? I would like to say I'm optimistic. I'm more of a realist, right? That's kind of how I define myself. In that, if I don't think something's likely, right? Like if logic kind of defies it, I'm going to be like, I don't know if that's going to happen, right? Here's what I love about this. Here's what God has to remind me so often, and I love this example. Over and over and over again. Look at me. God decides to make a way where I can't see one. He does that. That's what God does. Over and over and over again, right? Where my realism brings me down, God says, you know what? I'm capable to do more than your logic can fathom. I'm capable to do more than you can understand, right? Like, that's who God is. He's the God who parts waters when His children are backed into a corner, right? He's the God who closes the mouths of lions when His people are thrown in the pit, right? He's the God who walks up to the lame and says, get up, who walks up to the blind and says, see. He's the God who walks up to stones and He says, move and come out. That's the God we're talking about. He's able. And here's the good news tonight. We're like, Austin, that's cool and all, Paul's faith. It doesn't just have to be Paul's faith. Because the God who is able then is able now. God still does that stuff. He still can. Right? He is still fully able to do this. He's able. The God we serve is still able. And I hope this encourages you tonight. Because guys, listen, I know 2020 has been a roller coaster. Right? It has. But He is still fully capable of redeeming you, of restoring your relationships, of reconciling things that are broken in your life, of healing things that need to be healed. He's still fully capable of that in your life. I think so often we lose sight of God's greatness because we get so fixed on the problem. We do. And Paul, his whole attitude here is one of faith that says, you know what, I believe God's going to get me out of this thing. This is not some sort of prosperity gospel. It's called faith. It's called believing that God is able. Not that He's necessarily going to do what you demand, but that He's capable of doing it. Right? I love it, man. I love it. And Paul knew this, man, that no matter how bad his circumstances got, his God was greater than them. And he was going to be filled with joy because of it. I love that, man. So Paul, he ultimately won because he hopefully anticipated God's deliverance. And then secondly, to balance it out, he also faithfully displayed God's magnificence. Check out verse number 20. Right in the middle. He says this, that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but that with all boldness, as always, so now also Christ shall be magnified in my body, whether it be by life or by death. Change of a tone there, right? He's talking about hoping to get out, and now all of a sudden he's talking about dying. How do we reconcile that? Right? How do we reconcile that? I love this, man. Here's what he says, if I could summarize it. He says, I'm not going to be ashamed either way. If I die in here or if I get out. He says, here's why. Because of the boldness that I have, that I always have. He says, as always, I'm bold now, and Christ will be magnified in my life regardless. In my life regardless. I love this, man, because here's what it shows us. Paul had determined that one thing, look at me, that one thing would be constant in his life. That it would magnify the name of Jesus. Regardless of what happened. Did he hope for the best? Absolutely. But was he ready in case that didn't happen? Yes. And he said, even if the very best doesn't happen, I'm still going to magnify Jesus. Right? If anything good happens, He's magnified. If anything bad happens, He's magnified. If I live, He's magnified. If I die, He's magnified. If I'm freed, He's magnified. If I stay here for the rest of my life, He's magnified in me. That was a decision He made, right? That was a decision He made. It wasn't based on His circumstances. It was a decision in life or death. And I love this, man, because you know what that means for us? Paul understood this thing one way. It's a win-win. All he could do was win, for lack of a better phrase, right? Like there was no losing for him. You know what I mean? It's like if I die, Christ is magnified. If I continue to live, Christ is magnified. I win either way. And I love the balance that this brings to our discussion tonight. Because again, we just talked about how Paul believed that God would deliver him from prison. But here we are, finding him saying, even if He doesn't, I'm going to praise Him. I'm going to worship. I'm going to magnify Him. I hope He does this. I know He's able. But if He doesn't, I'm still going to magnify Him. The name of Jesus. Because here's what this teaches us, man. All right? And I kind of changed it up like 1,000 times today. So if it doesn't make sense, I'm sorry. Sometimes I overthink. But here's what I think it's showing us. Is that joy is found in both knowing that God can deliver, and it's also found in trusting in Him when He doesn't. It's both and, man. It's not one or the other. We find joy in Him knowing that He's able, but even when He doesn't, we find joy in trusting Him anyways. Because the truth is, God is not always going to do what He could. God is not always going to do what you think He should. And even then, He's still trustworthy. He's still worthy to be magnified, right? That's the whole point here, and I love what he's getting to. I love that regardless, Paul was going to be worshiping no matter what happened. And here's what I love about this phrase, man, is you and I are so good at that first part. We are. We're good at finding joy in the fact that God is able, right? Like that's encouraging. That's exciting. It encourages me to know that God is capable to do whatever He wants and to work in ways that I can't imagine. That encourages me, right? And we're all about that. But when it comes to the second part of this thing, it gets a little bit harder, right? And so often we get frustrated when God doesn't do what we know He could. Have you guys been there? Seriously, stay with me. Have you guys been there? Right? You've been like, God, I really need You to do this. I really need this to happen. I really need You to show up in this way. And He doesn't. Right? Have you ever asked God why? Well, you're not alone if you have. God, why didn't You do what I asked? God, why didn't you show up in the way that I was expecting? Why didn't You do what I needed, God? Right? And we wrestle with that. And in that wrestling, to be honest, we start to have a little bit of bitterness. Because God didn't do what we expected. And in that bitterness, we lose sight of joy. And here's what I love about Paul's example. Look, guys. Is that once again, he's reminding us of this. That there is a joy that supersedes, right? It transcends our circumstances. That if God doesn't come through, we can still be joyful, knowing that He's still working something out and trustworthy in that. Right? I know that's not popular. I know right now it's all about, declaring things and making sure that they're going to come true and believing and all of this. And I'm not against some of this stuff, right? Again, believing that God is able. But there's a large portion of life where God doesn't do what we ask, and we've got to learn how to wrestle with that. That is most of life, right? He doesn't do what we ask all the time. But that doesn't mean He's not good. It doesn't mean He's not worthy of our magnifying, and that we can't have joy, right? Regardless of what happened. And I love this, man, because here's the truth of it. This is a joy that he's demonstrating, a joy that says it doesn't matter what happens. Jesus is great, and He's going to be magnified in my life, whatever may come. And here's the truth of it. Here's the example of it. When exalting Jesus is your priority, your circumstances will always be secondary. Secondary meaning here, not as important. You know what I mean? We like to reverse those things. Jesus, I'll magnify You when my circumstances are what I wanted, when life is how I expected, how I planned. But what we see here is that's backwards, right? Exalting Him, that's what's primary. That's what's the priority. In the circumstances, they don't get to dictate whether we can do that. We can do that either way. And that's the example, man. And this is why, for Paul, it was a win-win. And I'm winding down, guys. Point number 3 tonight. Paul also ultimately won because he desperately longed for God's presence. Check it out. Verse 21. He says this, "For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain." All right, guys, I know, bumper sticker verse alert, right? We've all heard it before. Stop for a second. Do you realize how world-changing that thought is? Right? If I'm going to live, if I'm going to be alive, I'm going to do everything for Christ. Christ is going to be my life. And if I die, that is to my benefit. No one talks like that. Newsflash for you guys. Death is not fun, but it's coming. Right? Everybody who lives dies at some point. Right? 100%. Every time. And for ages, listen to me guys, ages, it has been our biggest enemy, our greatest defeat, ever since the garden, because of our sin, right? That we've been dealing with this death, with this loss, right? And it has been our biggest enemy. And here Paul is saying this. He's saying, you know what? That which, look guys, stay with me. That which most of the world is spending their entire life to avoid, I actually think it's my benefit. What? That's mind-blowing. No one else can say that. Buddhists don't get to say that. Hindus don't get to say that. Naturalists don't get to say that. Modernists don't get to say that. Right? Humanists don't get to say that. Muslims, they don't get to say that with certainty. Right? Only Jesus can provide that kind of outlook to say, man, even in my death there is victory, and death for me is gain. No one in the world gets to say that except for Christians. What a powerful thing. That even our greatest threat, being death, man, it's been done away with. It's lost its sting, according to Paul. Because Jesus has faced it and has given us life over it. That's what he's saying, man. And check out verse number 22. Verse 22 says, "But if I live in the flesh, this is the fruit of my labor. Yet what I shall choose, I what not." That means I don't know. He's saying if I'm alive, man, I'm going to labor. I'm going to bear fruit, right? Like we've been talking about on Sundays with abiding in Christ. I'm going to bear fruit. He says, what I'm going to pick, if I had to choose, he says, I don't really know. He's talking about like living and dying here. Just to remind you, right? Like, shouldn't be a hard option here, right? I'm going to stay alive, right? Not Paul. He says, I don't really know what I would choose. Why? Because verse number 23 says, I am at a strait between. Love that word betwixt. It makes me think of a candy bar. I'm a strait between two, having a desire to depart, to be with Christ. Look at this last phrase, which is far better. Which is far better. Paul says, man, I'm wrestling. I'm caught in between two because on one hand, I want to go be with Him. I want to be in His presence. I want to see Jesus face to face. I want to worship Him. I want to know Him. I want to fellowship with Him. He says, and that is far better than anything I could do here. Far better than anything I could do here. He knows that to die is to be with Jesus, and to be with Jesus is far better than anything. And here's what that reminds me tonight, guys. Listen, this is very encouraging, I hope. That for the Christian, things are always looking up. Always. Right? Because we are always working towards an end which is far better than anything we could have now. You might be having a terrible time. Life may be holding you down in a very heavy way. I get that. But if you are a child of God, right, if you've been redeemed by Jesus, then man, your future is bright, regardless of what you're in. Right? Absolutely. Right? Things are always looking up. And for this reason alone, listen, I'm getting close to done. For this reason alone, you and I have more reason to rejoice than anybody else on earth. We do. Because even if our entire life here is nothing but pain and sorrow, because of what Jesus has done, we have an eternity to rejoice, to look forward to. Things are always looking up. This is as bad as it will ever get for the Christian. Right? This is it, man. It's always going to get better. I love it. And I love the wrestling we see here. Right? I love it. But the struggle was this. Paul said, while I long to be with Jesus, I know that I'm also needed here. And we're going to get to that in a second. But we see this struggle. And it reminded me of this quote that I saw the other day by a missionary, an old missionary. His name was Adoniram Judson. Anybody ever heard that name before? Very famous. He's kind of a hero of the faith past couple hundred years. Incredible guy. Missionary to Burma for many years. Translated scriptures, all sorts of stuff. He served faithfully over there. Someone asked him about it at the end of his life, and look at what he said. I loved how he talked about his death, his upcoming death. He said this, I am not tired of my work, neither am I tired of the world. Yet, look at this. Yet when Christ calls me home, I shall go with the gladness of a boy bounding away from the school. Do you guys, you remember what it was like being a kid coming home from school? Right? I do. Growing up in Florida, right? I loved it, man. As a kid, you had no worries when you got other than homework, right? and you just avoided that, right? Procrastination starts young, right? I remember getting home, throwing my book bag somewhere, don't even know where, somewhere in the house, I hope, right? Going straight outside. Me and Alex, I don't know why, in Florida, there's a lot of reptiles everywhere, right? Florida. And so we would just spend hours outside on our chain link fence, picking up baby lizards, putting them in a bucket. And then, like, when the day was done, we just let them go and do it again tomorrow. Like, that's what we love to do. We like, I don't know, okay, I don't know. This is what we did. But I remember how much fun it was, how much joy it was to go home and just to say, you know what? All of that stuff is done. And you know what it was? As a kid, you didn't think about tomorrow, right? You didn't worry about what was coming. All you said was this, for now I'm going to enjoy life. And you didn't even know that that was what's happening. You're just doing it. He says that's the same reaction he's going to have when Jesus calls him. He's going to let it all go and say, you know what? I can finally enjoy what it means to be alive. Right? Just sit in the presence of Jesus. He says, I'm not looking to die. I'm not tired of it. I'm not tired of my work. I'm not tired of this world. But man, if he were to call me home, I'm there. I'm ready with all the gladness in my heart. Man, speaks volumes to me. To me, man, I hope that I can share just a glimpse of that same anticipation to be home with Jesus. And then lastly, man, point number 4 tonight, and we'll wrap up. Paul ultimately won because he selflessly served God's people. Look at verse number 24 over to verse 26. Paul says this, nevertheless, in verse 24, to abide in the flesh is more needful for you. He says, I really want to die and go see Jesus, but you guys need me. That's a summary, right? There it is. Verse 25, and having this confidence, I know that I shall abide and continue with you all for your furtherance and joy of faith, that your rejoicing may be more abundant in Jesus Christ for me by my coming to you again. He says, because I know that you guys need me, because I'm needed to do some stuff still, he says, I'm confident that this is going to work out in a different way, right? And I want you to think about this for a second. I want you to compare verse 23 and verse 24, where he says, man, it is far greater to be with Jesus. And then he turns around and he says this, but I know you guys need me. I know you guys need me. This is huge, man. This is so selfless when we really compare it. Because when I read this, look, I'm almost done, guys. I ask the question, why in the world would he be torn about this? Right? When you put it in terms that he put it, I want to go see Jesus. It's far greater. I don't want to stay here with you guys. I don't care if you need me or not, right? Paul's like, why is he torn here? Because to go to Christ means this for Paul. It means the end of his shackles. No more chains for him. No more being beaten in the streets. No more being stoned by a mob. Right? No more being ridiculed or argued with or belittled or made fun of. None of that. All of that ends. And yet he says, if it's necessary for you guys, I'll trade it. He says, I will gladly postpone the eternal joy that waits for me just to help grow yours now. Oh, That's what he says. He says, so that way your joy would be fulfilled. He says, I will postpone what's waiting for me in order to serve and to grow with you right here, right now. You know what that does, man? It shows me that Paul, he understood this thing. To live was Christ. To live was to know Him, to make Him known, to magnify Him, to love His people, to serve God's church. And to die was to be with Him. So either way this thing works out, guess what? It's a win. It's a win. Either way, Paul wins. And I love this, man. He recognized that either way his life went, he had a chance to serve, a chance to worship, a chance to know Christ more, and to make Him known in a greater way. Last thought, and I'll be done. Kind of a summarizing thought of what we see from Paul here. That is this. The Christian life may know much about temporary trials, suffering, and pain. But listen, man, listen. But it knows nothing of defeat. It knows nothing of defeat. Man, we may go through these trials. We may have this pain. We may feel this sorrow. But listen to me, we know how it ends. We know where we're going. We know what Christ has done. We know what He has secured. And we know what our end is. There is no defeat. Man, we may struggle. We may hurt. But there is no defeat. Right? Because in Christ, right? All we can do is win. Now, don't take that where I'm not meaning it, right? Obviously, there are things that are defeated in our life, right, when we surrender to Christ. But man, big picture, listen, guys, there is no defeat for us. Because He's already got the victory. And we rest in that.